I came across an interesting story the other day. You know, we talk about affordability so regularly now, but typically we look at the cost of living, don't really consider what it might be to live somewhere else. And when we do, we talk about moving perhaps out of the city and moving into a more, I don't know, urban area or residential area, depending on how you want to look at it. But then there's a story on basically what, affordability in the rest of the country looks like. And I thought this was fascinating because I'm sure there's some things in here that many people would not have perhaps realized. So we thought we'd look into it. Mathieu Laberge is chief economist at the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. Mr. Laberge, thanks for being on this afternoon. Let me begin by asking, you've seen the study on affordability in different parts of the country. What surprised you the most, if anything, in this study?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I think what came out as the most surprising for me out of all the studies we've done on affordability across the country is when it comes to housing, and especially rental housing, the second least affordable city across the country is Halifax. There were trends over there very recently that made the affordability deteriorates quite drastically in the small town. And, you always think about the bigger centers, but Halifax is the second least affordable housing city across Canada.
Yeah, one of the other those, and I understand on housing, right? That's a big factor for people, but I think the basic story is if you're thinking of making that move, regardless of what province you're thinking of going to, there are a lot of different things to take into account. It's not an easy plus or 1 + 1 = 2 situation, right?
Yeah, exactly. You have to take so much into account. There's, obviously, much can in different cities, because right now, there's a trend towards going back to the office. So under the COVID, virtual work environment was completely different. You could keep your job and work virtually from anywhere. But now it's less than the case. You have to take into account how much can you earn, the cost of housing, the cost of food in some regions of Canada that varies greatly, as well as how much discretionary income is left at the end of the month, so you can actually face the different other expenses you have to face.
Yeah, and when you break down the the list here, it's interesting, right? Alberta, we know they have lower tax rates. That's obviously an advantage, but then let's say you live in Quebec and you're thinking a move to Alberta would make sense to you because Quebec is so heavily taxed. That's not necessarily at the end of the day the way it works out.
Well, exactly, because when you look at it, you have to look at it holistically. So sometimes there's lower taxes, but what service do you receive in exchange for those taxes also count. In Quebec, for example, one example is des centres de la petite enfance, the daycare system that's pretty evolved and relatively accessible. There's still backlogs as everywhere else, but it's more accessible than elsewhere in Canada. And I've been even an example taken to build the Pan-Canadian system. And so that's something that's an offset from your taxes that you also have to take into account when considering to move across different provinces.
It's worth noting that using this, what you call a market basket measure, which calculates the cost of, a lot of different things, food, clothing, shelter, etc. It turns out, even with the lower tax rate, just as an example, Alberta is one of the more expensive places to live in Canada.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why it's so important to look at the whole situation, not to take one area specifically like housing or taxes. You have to look at the whole situation as well as, your earning prospects in the different cities you're considering and to make it all in the balance and make the right choice for you.
With respect to, the cost of living across the country, when you do all this and add everything together, how does Quebec fare?
Well, it's relatively good, and for a reason that the economy in Quebec up to very recently has been pretty robust compared to other provinces across the country. Cost of living is relatively cheaper in Quebec as well compared to Ontario or BC, for example. It's driven a lot by obviously the housing situation, but also with food and other goods that are more accessible across Quebec, as well as, the other thing I think that's really important is to consider the makeup of the household, right? It will be very different for two individuals versus a family. So these are all factors to take into account.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, right? Because if you're living as a single person, you might say to yourself, well, it doesn't make sense. You pay so much tax in Quebec. I'm going to move somewhere else. But if you are a family, those benefits are built in. And it would actually cost you less to live here.
Exactly. And, when I did my undergrad at the University of Montreal, and one textbook's case was, a young family with children had a relatively good access back then to a healthcare system, had very good access to dental care for the kids as well as to daycare. And so all in all, Quebec was seen as a relatively favorable place for families when you take everything into account.
I did want to point out one other thing. We haven't talked a lot about housing, but we all know, I think most people know, British Columbia, probably the most expensive place to live. Certainly Vancouver is the city. Where does Montreal fit in terms of major Canadian cities as far as affordability for housing, including rental?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So Montreal, has seen, like many other cities across the country, a decline in affordability from 2020 to 2023, but it has recovered since then. But when you compare the city, despite this deterioration, immediately post-pandemic, it remains one of the cities that is more affordable. It's certainly more affordable on the rental side, where when you compare to the average, Montreal remained one of the most affordable cities for rental across the 7 cities we were looking at in our index. On the home ownership, it's still a slightly less affordable than the average because of cities like Calgary or Edmonton, Halifax, that remain more affordable on the home ownership than Montreal. But it's still, relatively speaking, if you compare to Toronto and Vancouver, it's still a market where you can actually find home ownership options.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out a couple of things before we have to wrap up. I found this really interesting in this story, right? People don't think about it much. You live here, you complain about high car insurance costs, for example. Then you look at Ontario, where they're probably paying, I don't know, if not the highest, some of the highest insurance, almost double what you would pay in Quebec, right? So if you're a driver, that's something to consider as well. And then on the flip side, we don't think about this because, we live here. We like to complain about prices going up. But when it comes to utilities, Quebec's a winner in this, right?
Yes, absolutely. So the fabric of each province really mold how the costs are done, and the model in Quebec with Hydro-Quebec, with the SAEQ, is actually makes it one of the affordable areas in the country.
Yeah, and I will point out, by the way, in the study as well, they say the place where more Canadians are moving to than from is still, despite it all, Alberta, right?
Yes. Well, it's also driven by economic cycles, and what we see in Alberta is, when it's booming well, and when it's busting a lot. So there's a lot of interprovincial migration in and out from Alberta, depending on the economic cycle. Because Quebec is more diverse, the industries are more diversified. It's not as much as a boom and bust phenomenon that we observe. Yeah. It's a lot more stable.
All right, we will leave it at that. Maybe perhaps my favorite statement from the entire story was, if you're considering moving somewhere else, don't idealize where you're going. Lower your expectations is the key, huh?
Absolutely, and make it fit your own situation. Like, don't take, your friends or your family's example. Make sure it works for you and your family.
All right, we leave it at that. Thank you so much for your time. Very much appreciate it.
I appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Mathieu Laberge at the Mortgage and Housing Corporation of Canada.
iHeartRadio is throwing it back.
2010s, the decade.
To the days of huge hits and unforgettable anthems. A non-stop stream of the biggest and best.
Drake, Rihanna, Beyonce, Katy, Gaga, The Weeknd,
and more. All your decade-defining favorites, all in one place.
Hi, it's Katy Perry.
Hey, it's Bruno Mars.
This is Kesha.
Find 2010's The Decade on the free iHeartRadio app. Preset the station so it's always one tap away.